Medieval outlaws didn't freeze to death in forest, and that's the part that makes zero sense. No shelter, no supplies, temperatures dropping below zero, and yet they survived entire winters while trained soldiers died in heated castles. What did these criminals know that we've completely forgotten? Here's the thing about being declared an outlaw in medieval England. It didn't mean you were a criminal, it meant you were nothing. Literally outside the law's protection. Anyone could kill you on sight. No trial, no penalty, just a body in a ditch and maybe a small reward. So why would anyone choose to freeze in a forest instead of sneaking back into town? Because towns were death traps. Your neighbor who owed you money, he could legally slit your throat and collect a bounty. That's not a figure of speech. That was Tuesday. Now here's where it gets interesting. By the 12th century, royal forests covered roughly 30% of England. That's not a typo. Almost a third of the country was dense woodland under the king's control. And most of it, completely unpatrolled. See, sheriffs had horses. Horses need paths. The deep forest interior had neither. Mounted patrols stuck to edges and main tracks like my uncle sticks to the buffet line at weddings. They knew where they were comfortable, and they stayed there. But wait, weren't outlaws just romantic Robin Hood types stealing from the rich? Not even close. Most were desperate peasants. A farmer who couldn't pay his debts, a hungry man who killed a rabbit on the wrong land, someone who threw a punch that landed too hard. These weren't professional criminals. They were ordinary people who'd run out of options. The punishment for getting caught was hanging, sometimes mutilation first, branding if you were lucky. The forest might kill you slowly through cold and starvation. Civilization would kill you fast and painfully. And here's something that'll surprise you. Winter actually offered one genuine advantage. Frozen ground doesn't hold footprints like soft mud does. Sheriff's men tracking you through October muck could follow your path for miles. December frost, your trail vanished. So these desperate men chose the trees. They chose the cold. They chose probable death over certain death. But surviving a medieval winter in the wilderness required more than just hiding. It required shelter that could actually keep you alive. And the methods they used were surprisingly clever. So you've made it to the forest. Congratulations. Now you need somewhere to sleep that won't kill you by morning. First choice? Caves. Always caves. Any outlaw worth his salt searched for rock, overhangs, and shallow caverns before building anything. Why? Because rock holds heat better than anything you could construct with your bare hands. Plus, no assembly required. Nature already did the hard work about 1 million years ago. But here's the thing. Good caves were rare, and other people knew about them too. Wolves, for instance. Bears. Other outlaws who might not want company. No cave? Time to dig. Pit houses were the medieval version of a budget apartment. You'd excavate a hole roughly 3 feet deep, cover it with branches and debris, and climb inside. The earth itself kept you warm. At 3 feet down, ground temperature stays relatively constant year-round, around 50 degrees. Not exactly tropical, but 50 beats 20 when you're wearing stolen wool and your last meal was a squirrel. Then there's my personal favorite, hollow logs. I know. Sounds ridiculous, like something a cartoon bear would do, but large fallen trees with rotted-out centers worked surprisingly well for emergency situations. Your body heat filled that small space fast. Cozy? No. Alive? Yes. For groups, the bender shelter became standard. You'd find young saplings, bend them into arches, then pile on bracken, leaves, and moss, 2 feet thick on all sides, basically building yourself into a giant leafy cocoon. Location mattered enormously. South-facing slopes caught whatever weak winter sun existed. Hills behind you blocked northern winds. Get this wrong, and your perfect shelter becomes a wind tunnel. And snow? Let it pile up against your walls. Dead air space trapped between snow layers acts like insulation. Medieval outlaws figured out what modern survival experts charge money to teach. Makes sense, right? But even the best shelter meant nothing without one critical element: fire. And managing fire while hiding from people actively hunting you? That required tricks most people have completely forgotten about. Fire wasn't just nice to have, it was the difference between waking up tomorrow and becoming a frozen corpse for wolves to find. Here's a fact that might surprise you. A wet, exhausted person at near freezing temperatures can die from hypothermia in under 3 hours. Not days, hours. So Outlaws treated fire-making skills like we treat our smartphones today. Absolutely essential. Can't function without it. But here's the problem. Fire creates smoke, and smoke visible from miles away basically screamed, "Hey, Sheriff, free arrest over here." Not ideal when you're trying to avoid the noose. So what did they do? They got clever, really clever. The Dakota fire hole became their secret weapon. Picture 2 holes dug into the ground, connected by a tunnel underneath. One hole holds the fire. The other feeds air into it. The result? Incredibly hot flames with almost no visible smoke. It's like medieval engineering that actually worked. I've tried making one myself. Took me 4 attempts and a lot of swearing, but when it finally clicked, I understood why Outlaws swore by this method. Then there's the fuel problem. Wet wood produces thick white smoke that might as well be a signal flare. Experienced outlaws learned to store deadfall wood inside their shelters weeks before burning it. Patience was literally survival. And let's not forget the tools. Fire, steel, and flint became an outlaw's most prized possessions, often the only metal they owned. These got wrapped in leather and kept against the body at all times. Losing your fire kit in December meant death. Simple as that. Nighttime presented another challenge. You need heat to sleep, but flames glow. The solution was building fires in pits or behind natural rock screens that blocked light from distant observers. One careless fire on a ridgeline, sheriff's men could arrive within hours. The banking technique saved countless lives too. Outlaws buried hot coals under ash and dry soil before sleeping, then uncovered them at dawn. Free fire restart without the dangerous spark-making process, but keeping warm was only half the battle. Staying dry mattered even more. Here's the thing about medieval winter that most people get wrong. They assume cold air was the killer. Nope. Wet cold was what actually murdered you. An outlaw could handle freezing temperatures. What he couldn't survive? Getting soaked and staying that way. This is where wool became the most valuable fabric in existence. A soaked wool cloak still retained roughly 80% of its insulating ability. Linen, cotton, those became death sentences the moment they got wet. The fabric would cling to your skin, sucking heat from your body faster than the air ever could. So outlaws wore wool, lots of it. But here's where it gets interesting. Many outlaws wore stolen sheepskins with the fleece turned inward against their bodies. Same principle as that expensive fleece jacket you bought last winter. Turns out we didn't invent anything new. We just made it synthetic. Now let's talk feet. Medieval peasant shoes were basically leather socks with delusions of grandeur. Useless in snow, worse in slush. So experienced outlaws used wool foot wrappings instead. Strips of fabric wound around the feet and lower legs. Sounds primitive, right? But these wrappings could be adjusted for fit, dried faster than any shoe, and replaced from literally any scrap fabric you could steal. My grandmother used to say, "There's no bad weather, only bad preparation." She never lived in a 12th century forest, but she would have understood these outlaws perfectly. Animal fat became another survival tool. Outlaws rubbed it into leather and wool to create crude waterproofing. Smelled absolutely terrible. Worked surprisingly well. That greasy coating blocked wind and shed light rain, extending the life of garments by months. And clothing raids, those weren't crimes of greed. They were survival missions. Outlaws would hit isolated farmsteads in autumn specifically for wool cloaks and blankets. A good heavy cloak genuinely meant the difference between seeing spring and becoming a frozen corpse. But staying warm created another problem entirely. All that wool and animal fat, worthless if you couldn't put food in your belly, and winter hunting required knowledge that could get you hanged. Poaching the king's deer was punishable by death. Outlaws did it anyway. Because here's the thing about execution threats. They don't scare you when starvation is killing you first. A single red deer provided over 50 pounds of meat. That's weeks of survival from one successful hunt. Worth the risk? When your ribs are showing through your skin, absolutely. But smart outlaws didn't go straight for the big game. Too dangerous. Too much attention. Rabbits were the real MVP of winter survival. Technically, they weren't classified as game under forest law, which meant snares near forest edges could catch dinner without automatically earning you a noose. A simple loop of plant fiber positioned along a rabbit run worked while you slept. Passive income, medieval style. And winter actually helped hunters. I know, sounds backwards, but fresh snow turned the entire forest into a tracking map. Every deer, every rabbit, every squirrel left a perfect record of where they went and when. Animals also got desperate in deep winter. Less cautious, hungrier, just like the outlaws hunting them. Now here's something most people don't consider. Squirrels were fair game, so were dormice. Hedgehogs, too. Not much meat on any of them, but steady protein adds up. My grandmother used to say, little and often fills the belly. And she never even lived in a medieval forest, though her cooking sometimes made me wish I did. Wood pigeons stayed through winter. So did crows and pheasants. Simple spring traps made from bent branches could catch them with minimal effort or noise. The real skill? Preservation. Fresh meat spoils fast, even in cold weather. Outlaws smoked their kills over low fires for days, creating jerky that lasted months. This wasn't gourmet cooking. It was survival chemistry. Dried meat could be eaten cold during dangerous times when lighting a fire meant death. But hunting and trapping only worked if you knew the forest. And knowing the forest meant understanding what grew there, even when everything looked dead. Which brings us to something even more important than catching animals. Winter forests look dead. Bare branches, frozen ground, nothing green anywhere. Most people would starve in a week. Outlaws didn't. They knew secrets that kept them alive when the landscape seemed to offer absolutely nothing. And honestly, some of these tricks are so clever, they'd make modern survivalists jealous. Let's start with acorns. You can't just eat them raw. They're packed with tannins that'll make you violently ill. But here's what outlaws figured out. Bury them in a stream bed where cold water flows over them constantly. Wait about 3 weeks. The water leaches out all that bitter nastiness. What's left? Something you can grind into a flour-like meal that actually keeps you alive. Then there's the squirrel strategy. These little guys spend all autumn burying nuts everywhere. Outlaws watched them carefully in early winter, noting exactly where they dug. Later, when the squirrels came back for their stash, an observant outlaw got there first. Sorry, squirrels. But the strangest food source? Tree bark. I know, sounds desperate. Because it was. The inner layer of elm, birch, and pine, called the cambium, contains enough nutrients to prevent starvation. Outlaws stripped it off, boiled it into a gruel, and choked it down. Tasted absolutely terrible. Worked anyway. Rose hips were the real treasure, though. Those little red fruits stayed on bushes well into January, and they contained something outlaws didn't understand, but their bodies desperately needed. Vitamin C. Without it, your gums bleed, your teeth loosen, wounds won't heal. A handful of rose hips every few days prevented all that. Here's something that surprises people. Certain mushrooms actually thrive in freezing temperatures. Wood ear and velvet shank grow on dead logs throughout winter. You just need to know what you're looking at. And that's the crucial part right there. Which plants killed you versus which plants kept you alive. This wasn't information you could guess at. One wrong mushroom meant an agonizing death. One correct identification meant another week of survival. This knowledge passed between outlaw groups like precious currency. But finding food was only half the challenge. The other half? Finding water when everything's frozen solid. Here's the thing about winter that nobody thinks about. You're surrounded by water. Frozen water everywhere. Snow piling up, icicles hanging off every branch, streams turned to ice. And yet dehydration killed more outlaws than you'd expect? Sounds ridiculous, right? But eating snow directly was basically slow suicide. Your body had to burn precious calories to melt it, and that dropped your core temperature fast. In survival terms, you're trading hydration for hypothermia. Terrible deal. And here's the math that made it worse. You needed roughly 10 handfuls of snow to get 1 handful of actual water. That's a lot of melting, which meant constant fire access, which we already established was risky business. So what actually worked? Smart outlaws found spots where streams moved fastest. Those sections often stayed unfrozen even in brutal cold. Moving water doesn't ice over as easily. Find a little waterfall or a narrow gap where current picks up speed and you've got liquid water without needing fire at all. Then there were icicles. Now, I've personally licked a few icicles in my time. Who hasn't? but outlaws preferred the ones hanging off rock faces rather than tree branches. Ground snow picked up dirt, animal droppings, rotting leaves, icicles forming from runoff were basically filtered. Nature's Brita, if you will. But getting water was only half the problem. Keeping it liquid overnight, that was the real headache. Outlaws carried water in animal bladders or stolen leather bottles tucked against their bodies, under the cloak, against the chest. Your body heat kept it from freezing solid while you slept. Uncomfortable? Absolutely. Better than waking up to a useless ice ball? Also absolutely. The sneaky part about winter dehydration is that you don't feel thirsty. Cold air is dry air. Every breath you exhale carries moisture away. You're literally breathing out water vapor all day without realizing it. So outlaws had to drink even when they didn't want to. But staying hydrated alone wasn't enough. Because winter survival wasn't a solo sport, and the groups that formed in those frozen forests, they had their own brutal rules. Here's the thing about being a loner in medieval forests. It usually meant being a dead loner. Solo outlaws had roughly half the survival rate of those who grouped up. And the math isn't complicated. One person sleeping alone in a shelter, they freeze. 3 people huddled together. Body heat alone could raise the temperature by 10 degrees or more. That's not teamwork. That's basic thermodynamics saving your life. But you couldn't just team up with anyone who wandered into the woods. The sweet spot seemed to be groups of 5 to 15 people. Fewer than that, and you couldn't manage all the survival tasks. More than that, and you became impossible to feed. Plus, large groups left trails a blind sheriff could follow. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Division of labor turned these outlaw bands into surprisingly efficient little societies. One person tends the fire. Another checks the snares. Someone else watches the trail for patrols. Meanwhile, the rest forage. In winter, when daylight lasted maybe 8 hours, this multiplication of effort wasn't just helpful. It was essential. Trusted networks developed along forest paths, too. Allied camps would share information about where the sheriff's men were headed, or which areas still had game. Think of it like medieval social media, except instead of likes, you traded warnings about people trying to kill you. But betrayal? Always lurking. Many outlaws got captured because a desperate companion traded information for a pardon. Can't really blame them either. Starving in February with frostbitten toes, and suddenly the sheriff offers you a warm bed and a clean slate. That's a hard deal to refuse. The larger winter camps sometimes grew into actual communities. Women and children lived there. Hierarchies formed, leaders emerged. These weren't just hiding spots anymore. They were tiny illegal villages operating under the king's nose. Which brings up an uncomfortable truth. Outlaws didn't just survive by hiding and hunting. Sometimes they had to take what they needed directly from people who had it. And winter raids, those required a whole different kind of planning. Now here's where things get morally complicated. Surviving winter meant taking things that belonged to other people. Period. No way around it. The best targets? Isolated monasteries and manor granges. These places stockpiled food specifically for winter. Grain, salted meat, wool blankets, tools. Basically medieval Costco warehouses sitting out in the countryside with minimal security. But successful raiders weren't just desperate men charging in blindly. That got you killed or captured. The smart ones watched their targets for days first. When did guards switch shifts? Where were the dogs kenneled? Which buildings held the good stuff versus which ones had armed men sleeping inside? Timing was everything. Heavy snowfall? Perfect. You hit the place, grab what you can carry, and disappear into the trees. By morning, fresh snow covered your tracks completely. The sheriff's men would find nothing but footprints leading to a white wall of forest. Here's something that surprised me while researching this. Salt was often worth more than stealing silver. Seriously. You couldn't eat silver, but salt meant you could preserve meat through spring. One good salt raid could keep a camp alive for months, and not every encounter was violent. Some villages actually negotiated with outlaws. I know, sounds crazy. But think about it from a peasant's perspective. Fight a desperate armed group and maybe lose your winter hay stores to fire? Or trade some grain and cloth for a promise they'd leave you alone? Practical beats heroic every time. The most successful outlaws didn't just steal food either. They took tools, seeds, anything that suggested long-term thinking. Because deep down, most hoped for eventual pardons. They weren't planning to die in the forest. They were planning to rebuild lives someday. Makes sense, right? Survival today, but always one eye on tomorrow. Still, raiding was a gamble every single time. One bad raid, one witness who escaped, one dog that barked too early. Game over. But even successful raiders faced something worse than sheriffs. The real killer came in late February, and it had nothing to do with the law. So what happened to these people? Did they all swing from ropes? Actually, no. Most outlaw stories ended way less dramatically than ballads suggest. Royal pardons were surprisingly common. When kings needed soldiers for wars in France or Scotland, they suddenly became very forgiving. Murder, theft, poaching the royal deer, all forgiven if you carry a spear into battle. Funny how crimes become negotiable when someone needs cannon fodder. But here's the darker truth. Sheriffs didn't kill most outlaws. Disease did. Pneumonia from one too many wet nights, infected wounds that turned gangrenous, dysentery from bad water. The forest wasn't a romantic hideaway. It was basically a medieval hospital waiting room where nobody ever got called. The real killer, though, late February. That hungry gap between when stored food ran out and spring plants emerged. I've read accounts of outlaw camps found completely empty. No signs of violence, just people who simply stopped. Starvation is quiet like that. Some got lucky in weird ways. A relative dies, they inherit land, and suddenly our desperate forest criminal walks back into town as a legal landowner. Nobody asks questions when there's property involved. Same as today, really. And those legendary figures who supposedly lived decades in the Greenwood, the documented average was 2 to 7 years. That's it. Robin Hood surviving 40 years in Sherwood, either complete fiction or he had a really good accountant hiding him somewhere warm. The survivors, the ones who made it through multiple winters, became something valuable. Teachers. Their knowledge of shelter building, fire management, and food preservation kept newcomers alive. Experience became currency more valuable than stolen silver. Most outlaws weren't heroes or villains. They were desperate people caught between freezing forests and legal systems that offered them nothing but the gallows. Some found ways out. Some died quietly in the cold. Some probably just walked back home one day and hoped nobody remembered their face. The medieval forest wasn't a freedom fantasy. It was a brutal survival test that most people failed. But the ones who passed, they were tougher than any legend gives them credit for.